In this video, we're not talking about fantasy or myths. We're diving into one of the most ruthless punishments in medieval England, what it truly meant to be fed to the wolves. Not by beasts in the forest, but by your own society turning on you. This is the story of legal exile, public shame, and the terrifying reality of what happened when you crossed the crown. Number 1. Where the legend came from. The grim and dramatic image of traitors being fed to the wolves didn't arise from some cruel tradition of medieval English monarchs tossing prisoners to wild animals. In reality, it evolved from a dense web of ancient imagery, religious metaphor, and early legal codes that shaped public understanding of betrayal, punishment, and justice. Long before medieval England developed its complex feudal systems, the Roman Empire had already set a dark precedent with a brutal form of execution known as damnatio ad bestias. In this ritual of death, criminals were publicly condemned and thrown to wild beasts as entertainment, often lions, sometimes wolves. It wasn't just a method of execution, it was a carefully choreographed spectacle, one designed to display the crushing power of the state. Audiences cheered as men were torn apart, and the memory of these spectacles lingered far longer than the blood they spilled. When the Roman Empire crumbled, the imagery it left behind didn't vanish. It was picked up and carried forward by Christian chroniclers and theologians who recast the stories to suit their own messages. In Christian literature, the wolf took on a symbolic role that was even more ominous. No longer just a dangerous animal, the wolf became a stand-in for Satan himself. The deceiver, the predator that invades the flock, tears at the faithful, and undermines divine order. Preachers warned of wolves in sheep's clothing, of treachery that masquerades as loyalty. Over generations, these warnings became embedded in the cultural imagination, and the wolf ceased to be a mere animal. It became a symbol of corruption, danger, and lawlessness. By the time medieval England emerged, this symbolic weight had already taken root. But it wasn't only metaphorical anymore. The Anglo-Saxon legal system introduced the concept of caput lupinum, literally wolf's head. It was a chilling designation that marked an individual as legally dead. Anyone branded with it was no longer under the protection of the law and could be killed by anyone, anywhere, without fear of punishment. Calling someone a wolf in this context wasn't name-calling. It was a formal declaration that the person had lost all rights and recognition in society. They weren't to be judged or imprisoned. They were to be hunted. So when later generations spoke of a traitor being fed to the wolves, they were drawing from centuries of accumulated fear, symbol, and legal practice. Not actual animal attacks, but something more terrifying. Sanctioned, total erasure. Number 2, what wolf's head really meant. In the legal system of early medieval England, especially under the customs associated with the reign of Edward the Confessor in the 11th century, the term wolf's head, caput lupinum, wasn't just a dramatic insult. It was an official legal status, and a terrifying one at that. To be declared a wolf's head meant that a person had been fully and completely cast out from the protection of the law. They were, quite literally, no longer considered human in the eyes of society. The moment this status was announced, often shouted by a royal crier in a bustling public square, it functioned like a death sentence without the ceremony of a courtroom or the presence of a judge. From that instant on, anyone who encountered the person could kill them without hesitation and without any fear of legal consequences. This wasn't a decision made lightly or suddenly. Typically, it applied to individuals who had already been summoned multiple times to appear before the king's court and had willfully ignored the demands. It wasn't simply about avoiding taxes or a local dispute. It was a deep offense against royal authority itself. Repeated absence signaled rebellion, disloyalty, or contempt for the kingdom's justice system. And in a world where the crown was trying to hold together fragile networks of loyalty, any open defiance had to be crushed with both speed and symbolism. Once declared a wolf's head, a man was no longer a citizen or subject. He was considered an outlaw in the most literal sense. He couldn't seek refuge in a church. He couldn't appeal to any authority. He had no right to a trial. The law, instead of defending him, turned against him. Knights, soldiers, local watchmen, and even ordinary villagers were encouraged to hunt him down, kill him, and often claim a reward or status benefit. And that's what made the punishment so frightening. It outsourced justice to the people, making everyone a potential executioner. The comparison to a wild beast wasn't just poetic, it was deliberate and strategic. The law saw the outlaw as someone who had chosen to live outside the bounds of order and reason, and thus no longer deserved to be treated as a man. Killing such a person wasn't viewed as violence, it was seen as pest control. By turning a human into a symbolic wolf, the state gave society permission to act with brutal simplicity. No trial, no last words, no priest. Only the chase, the blow, and the silence that followed. Number 3. Why this was a military tool. In the chaos of medieval warfare, maintaining discipline was a constant battle of its own. The threat of violence from within was just as dangerous as the enemy across the field. That's why the concept of the wolf's head evolved into one of the most feared punishments, not just for outlaws, but specifically within the military. In theory, it was a legal term, stripping someone of the protection of law, but on the battlefield or in campaign camps, it turned into a ruthless tool of control. If a soldier disobeyed an order, abandoned his post, or acted without command, particularly by looting or yelling havoc, a term used to signal pillaging, he was instantly branded a traitor. Not in some metaphorical sense. In practical terms, he was now an outlaw, and the men beside him, those he once drank and marched with, were now authorized to kill him on sight. This wasn't just brutal, it was brilliantly effective. In the noise and confusion of battle, formal trials were impossible, but discipline still had to be enforced swiftly. So instead of waiting for a royal court to decide, captains and field commanders leaned on this ancient legal device. The moment someone was declared a wolf, they were no longer a soldier. They were a threat. And removing that threat didn't require permission. What made this method even more chilling was its social effect. Soldiers knew that one wrong move could mean being marked, hunted, and left unburied. Brotherhood turned to suspicion. Everyone watched everyone else, not just for glory or for loot, but for survival. This fear of sudden, irreversible punishment kept order in a way that no sermon or contract ever could. The wolf's head wasn't just a sentence, it was a weaponized reputation, and in the machinery of war it served its purpose without mercy. Number 4. Why actual wolves didn't matter. By the late 13th century, the physical presence of wolves in England had all but vanished. These animals, once widespread across the island, were seen not only as a threat to livestock and settlements, but also as symbolic enemies of civilization. During the reign of King Edward I, their extermination became a deliberate state policy. He commissioned hunters, most famously Peter Corby, to conduct organized wolf hunts, particularly in the Welsh Marches, a region viewed as wild, rebellious, and difficult to govern. These hunts weren't casual endeavors, they were royal operations, fully supported and funded, aimed at purging the last symbols of untamed nature from a kingdom striving for centralized control. By the early 14th century, wolves had already become rare. As forests were cleared for farmland and human settlements expanded, wolves lost both their habitat and food sources. Their image as feral beasts persisted, but sightings dwindled rapidly. By the time the Tudor dynasty ruled, and especially under Henry VII, the extinction of wolves in England was effectively complete. No official reports mention live wolves roaming the English countryside after his reign. This makes the idea of actually feeding a traitor to wolves not just improbable, but impossible in a literal sense. And yet, the phrase endured. Why? Because its symbolic weight far exceeded any need for realism. Saying someone was fed to the wolves wasn't meant to describe an actual event. It was a powerful way of showing that a person had been completely abandoned, stripped of their rights, and left to be torn apart by whatever forces, human or otherwise, came for them. In a society where law and honor determined survival, being cast out like a beast with no recourse to justice was often worse than a formal execution. The wolves in these stories weren't animals. They were a metaphor for the raw, merciless force of medieval law and public vengeance. Number 5. Real wolf-themed punishments. Although the literal threat of wolves had largely disappeared from England by the late medieval period, the symbolic use of the animal persisted with disturbing clarity in law, punishment, and public memory. Wolves became more than predators. They represented lawlessness, exile, and irredeemable guilt. This image was weaponized in various ways, particularly when it came to penal practices designed to punish or isolate those seen as threats to